Were you the kid in your friend group that had the Sega? Did people spend an inordinate amount of time playing Sonic or a bloody version of Mortal Kombat at your house? Or did you have to go to another friend's house? Either way, you do know what I'm talking about, right? Sega was awesome. For a time, it had a greater share of the home console market than Nintendo. It was winning the console wars. And while it was never going to permanently drive Nintendo down a bottomless pit, it absolutely had the advantage. What it lacked was the strategic competence to hold that advantage. Sega had the lead, but it lost it. And Sega lost the lead because it made a series of really, really bad decisions. Like most business mistakes, there wasn't one error, but many. And these errors added up over time. Ultimately, they led to Sega's demise. In this video, we're going to review Sega's mistakes and take a look at how things could have gone differently. To chronicle how far Sega fell, we need to take a quick look at how they rose. Despite the Japanese roots of the company, Sega traces its history back to America. In 1940, Irving Bromberg, Martin Bromley, and James Hubert formed Standard Games out of Honolulu. The goal of the company was to create coin-operated amusement machines to army bases that had such heavy presence in Hawaii. Standard Games eventually morphed into service games, and the company continued to create slot machines. When U.S. law changed to ban the use of slot machines in U.S. territories, the company sent employees to Japan to continue operating. In 1965, Service Games purchased Rosin Enterprises, which was making photo booths and coin-operated games. The resulting company? Sega Enterprises. Sega then got into the arcade business, making classic games like Periscope. In 1970, they opened their first arcade and continued down this business path, turning it into a huge financial success. By 1979, the company's revenues grew to over $100 million. Sega had a culture of innovation, and by the early 1980s, the company saw money in the home console market. The result of that change in business perspective was the SG-1000, which was released in Japan in 1983. This was the first home console created by Sega. It would not be the last. The SG-1000 sold 160,000 units in 1983 and was both a critical and commercial hit. It was followed by the SG-1002 in 1984, which made a series of upgrades to both the consoles and the graphics of the game. In total, the SG-1000 series sold 1.4 million units, and that was only in Japan. The success of this console led to the Master System, which sold against the Nintendo and was Sega's 8-bit system. Unlike the SG-1000 series, the Master System was sold in America and throughout the rest of the world, marking Sega's first attempt to expand their home console system worldwide. The system sold between 10 and 13 million units and marked Sega's true entry as a player in the home console market, albeit a junior one. The Nintendo Entertainment System sold 60 million units across the world. Seeking to expand to a worldwide presence that could do battle with Nintendo, Sega hired Tom Kalinske, former Mattel CEO, to run Sega of America. Kalinske helped to reposition the brand as edgier, build an improved system, and ultimately launched Sega ahead of Nintendo. In January 1992, Sega had a 65% share of the home console market. They were winning the war. And then things went wrong. Sega stumbled with every other console launch after the Genesis, and these critical mistakes cost them their market share lead and eventually their entire slice of the home console market. Sega's efforts to innovate started with the Sega CD. Released between 1991 and 1993 across the world, the Sega CD was an effort to innovate the Genesis. The system was an add-on to the original Genesis and could be physically attached to the original system in a couple of different ways. It allowed for the use of CD-ROM type games, which had better graphics, games with 160 times more storage than traditional CDs, and the use of audio CDs within the system. As noted in the book Console Wars, the system made its North American sales premiere at a massive New York event on October 15th, 1992. The event used jumbotrons to show the size and scale of the system, and it was a big hit. The event was meant to take Sega to the next level, which was the point, as Sega's slogan at the time was, "Welcome to the next level." Some of the games that came out on this system were highly regarded. That included Sonic CD, Final Fight, and the infamous Night Trap, a game so violent and gory that it helped spurn congressional hearings and the creation of the ESRB, or Entertainment Software Ratings Board. That is an entirely other video. However, the Sega CD didn't work. Sega ran into competition from the Amiga CD32 and the 3DO, and unfortunately, the device always struggled to find its footing. There were a few reasons for this. First, the price. At $299, the price was high, and while the price did drop in 1995, customers were more than willing to wait for other systems. Kalinske had urged a lower price, but Sega declined. Launch titles were also slow. For example, in Japan, only 2 games were available at launch, and only 5 were published by Sega in its first year. There were other game problems. 207 total games would be created, but many games, including Batman Returns and Echo the Dolphin, were just ports of existing games, and that hurt the reception of the system. Finally, Sega failed to adequately support third party developers and was delayed in releasing the necessary software development kits. Production shortages also hampered the system. Only 50,000 units were available for the US premiere, and only 70,000 units were available in Europe. Of course, that didn't matter because barely 60,000 sold in the continent during its first 4 months. In the end, the Sega CD only sold 2.24 million units. It was a half hearted effort that didn't have the support it needed, and it flopped. And that was just the start of Sega's troubles. By 1992, development for the next Sega system, the Saturn, was underway. However, estimates held that the system would not be ready until late 1995. In 1994, Sega felt that they needed to protect their market position, and the Sega CD had failed. Other systems, including the Atari Jaguar and 3DO, were threatening Sega. Their idea was to release a transition system that could hold the company over until the Saturn was released. Thus, the 32X was born. The basic idea for the 32X was honestly pretty similar to the Sega CD. It was another half system. Like the Sega CD, the Sega 32X would fit into the existing Genesis. This should have been an indicator that it was a bad idea, but whatever. The system was powerful. It contained two CPUs and a visual display processor that was meant to serve as a 32-bit system. It was supposed to be the cheaper alternative to the Sega Saturn, but with an introductory price at $159, it really wasn't all that inexpensive. In fact, many in Sega didn't want the 32X at all. For example, Tom Kalinske wanted to stick with the Genesis, thinking he could get at least another year out of the system, but he was overruled. The system was also rushed. How rushed? Well, the idea was conceived in 1994 at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show, and the system made its North American premiere 11 months later. Not great. And that led to a ton of problems in and of itself. Indeed, Sega of Japan had insisted on a Christmas launch, but refused to provide the necessary support. As noted in Console Wars, Sega of America requested 1 million units, but only got 400,000. The launch looked half-hearted. At the same time, Nintendo stuck with their philosophy of iterating within their existing system, releasing Donkey Kong Country the same day that the 32X made its North American premiere. This revolutionary game used pre-rendered graphics and wound up selling at 9.3 million copies, which is more than 10 times as many units as the 32X sold in total. Once again, Sega had released a new system without a strategy. Even worse, the system made its North American debut a literal day before the Saturn was released in Japan. In other words, third party developers weren't going to create games for a system with no future, not when a more expensive, powerful, and presumably better supported Saturn was coming out. In the end, only 40 games were released for the 32X, an astonishingly low number. Not helping things? Sega screwed up the back end. Software development kits were late, hindering game development. A chip shortage led to Sega splitting chips between the Saturn and the 32X. The rushed nature of the system development meant that games were poorly designed and had a slew of quality issues. The system sold no more than 800,000 units before being discontinued in 1996. It was, yet again, a massive failure. Now, lest you think that Sega's mistakes were confined only to the home console market, I give you the Game Gear. And stop me if you heard this one before. The Game Gear failed because of the lack of a strategic focus from Sega, who, once again, launched a system without the necessary ecosystem, technology, or ability to properly support it. Game Gear was behind the Game Boy, which launched in 1989 and was a massive hit, ultimately becoming the fourth best-selling system of all time. Not the 80s or the 90s, not just handheld systems, but ever. Facing that kind of pressure, Sega was forced to go deep and go different. The Game Gear was the result. The system made its premiere in 1990 in Japan and 1991 in North America. It boasted a full-color screen complete with 4,096 possible colors. The system looked sharp, like the Sega itself, and was marketed as a more mature alternative to the Game Boy. It had a ton of potential. In fact, according to Console Wars, Kalinske was shown a prototype of the system, and that ultimately helped convince him to leave Mattel and join Sega. But the issues! First, as noted by many, including pretty much every comment of mine in the video comment section on the Game Gear video we did, there were the batteries. The thing required 6 AA batteries and lasted 5 hours at the most and 3 hours at the least. The Game Boy went 30 hours on 4 AA batteries. So the Game Gear was expensive and inconvenient. The system sold for $149.99 and the Game Boy was only $89.99. And that was before batteries or games. And finally, again, third-party support. At the time of the launch, Nintendo still had many third-party developers locked up in exclusive contracts. The practice would change, but Sega didn't have the infrastructure to develop as many of their own games. Nintendo leaned heavily on their third-party ecosystem. Sega couldn't match it. Furthermore, Sega's need to play catch up meant that it didn't have the resources to compete with the Game Boy. While the Game Boy was launched with a $10 million marketing investment, the Game Gear didn't have anything close to it. Ultimately, the investment showed in units sold. The Game Gear sold 10.8 million units, barely a fraction of the 118 million Game Boys that were sold. That was 3 failed systems, but they weren't the tentpole platforms. Surely Sega would do better with the Saturn, right? Facing outside pressure and competition, Sega got too cute with the Saturn. Development of the system started in 1992 when the Genesis was still going strong. A recurring theme reared its ugly head again. Sega of America, led by Tom Kalinske, fought with Sega of Japan on the architecture of the system, with Kalinske arguing against Japan's version of the graphics chip. In the end, the Saturn got caught between other systems that were being released at the same time. Remember, the Nintendo 64 was coming out in 1996, and Sony PlayStation was coming out in 1994. With new systems breathing down its neck, Sega had to get the Saturn out as quick as possible. It also had to compete with new systems in terms of game quality, pricing, and graphics. Sega already had enough problems. The Sega CD, 32X, and Game Gear were splitting the attention of their R&D teams. Sega actually pulled developers from their arcade division in order to make games for the Saturn. According to Console Wars, Joe Miller of Sega of America called the system, quote, less sophisticated than I would have expected. Still, the system's Japanese launch started well, and it beat the PlayStation on the market by 2 weeks. Originally, the United States launch was planned for September 2nd, 1995, and then things went south. Seeking an advantage over PlayStation's North American launch, scheduled for September 9th, 1995, Sega screwed up. Mandated by Sega of Japan, Tom Kalinske delivered a keynote address at the first ever E3, in which he announced the price of the system, $399, and said it was for sale right now at Toys R Us, Babbage's, Electronics Boutique, and Software Etc. Only 30,000 units had been shipped. Why did this go bad? Let's count the ways. First, at the same event where Kalinske surprise launched the Saturn, PlayStation immediately undercut Sega with an announcement of their own. Just after Kalinske's speech, Steve Race was asked to give his speech and unveil the price of the Sony PlayStation. Race's speech was one word. $299. $100 cheaper than the Saturn. Next, marketing support. If you are going to launch a major system years in the making, you have likely planned a marketing campaign to build interest and word of mouth. That involves tens of millions of dollars in TV, print ads, radio ads, and more. It also involves a well thought out campaign that builds momentum and hits certain timelines. Sega decided to take their own marketing plans and fire them into the sun. By launching early, Sega deleted 4 months of marketing planning on a hope. It didn't work. And speaking of marketing, the North American launch also bumped the European launch, which also didn't have time to prepare or market accordingly. Sony spent £20 million marketing their system launch in Europe. Sega spent merely $4 million. The early launch also pissed off other realtors. Companies not involved in the initial launch were not happy to be shut out. Yes, the units sent to the lucky retailers who were given units moved quickly, but that didn't do much for those left out in the cold. Best Buy, Walmart, and KB Toys all refused to carry the system. And last, games. Early launch? Barely any games. There were only 6 available when the system launched, compared to 11 for the PS1. Some of the games were good, including Virtua Fighter, but they weren't good enough. And for all the stress caused by the surprise launch, it didn't work. By the time the PlayStation launched in North America, Saturn had a 5-month lead. In 2 days, Sony outsold everything that the Saturn had done. By July 1996, Tom Kalinske was out at Sega. The Saturn sold 9.26 million units worldwide. The PS1 sold 102.49 million units, on its way to becoming the 6th most popular video game system of all time. This covers the systems, but it doesn't cover some of Sega's other problems. The company had an unfortunate history of failed negotiations, and had any of these gone right, Sega might have landed in a very different place. For example, Sony and Nintendo had a rather infamous falling out when Sony approached the video game behemoth about partnering up to make a CD-based system. When that failed, Sony approached Sega. Let's go back to the development of the Saturn. In the early 1990s, Tom Kalinske met with Olaf Olofsson and Mickey Schuloff, both of Sony. At a private club on top of Sony's New York offices, the 3 men discussed a possible joint venture, a CD-based video game system. The potential shared venture was driven by the possibility of working together, innovating together, making money together, and a mutual hatred of Nintendo. A partnership was born, and it went well at first. The 2 agreed to invest in game developers. and had engineers working on a CD console. However, ultimately, the deal went nowhere. Sega's board of directors called it a, quote, stupid idea, believing that Sony was incapable of keeping up with the company. Yeah. Not satisfied with botching one business relationship, Sega entered into a failed merger with Bandai, a successful Japanese toy maker and video game developer. Bandai had developed video games since the 1980s and had a large stake in the worldwide market, so a merger would seem to make sense. As proposed in 1997, the merger would involve a $1 billion stock swap. Sega would acquire Bandai, dissolve the company, and create Sega Bandai. Had the merger worked, it would have been completed in the back half of 1997. However, it was not to be. Bandai employees rebelled, arguing that the company's cultures would not mesh well together, a common problem in many business mergers. Specifically, according to a 1997 Wired article on the subject, Bandai mid level executives believed that their business ran like a family business and found Sega's corporate business model to be incompatible with theirs. Sega's executives were worried about the same issues, and employee opposition was significant enough that the merger was called off. So again, I want to be clear about this. Hindsight is 2020. It's really easy to sit here in my chair with my microphone to blame Sega for the decisions that they made, but the truth is that it's easy to imagine a world in which any of these decisions could have played out differently. None of Sega's strategic mistakes should take away from their very real accomplishments in the video game world. However, the company was too impatient and failed to learn from its mistakes. They jumped the gun repeatedly and launched systems before having the necessary supports, technological ecosystem, or marketing backing. As a result, the company failed and left the console business after the Dreamcast failed to make any significant commercial headway. However, again, you can't take away from the very real legacy of Sega. Sega and the Genesis changed our video game world and left a pretty major mark on many of our childhoods. We'll talk about that one in the next video.